humans have consistently displayed extraordinary creativity in devising increasingly gruesome methods to torture and execute one another. In this compilation, I've gathered 10 of the most brutal, cruel, and painful techniques. If you find it difficult to endure, I recommend refraining from watching this video. However, if your curiosity persists, let's explore from the less severe to the most horrifying. Number 10. Waterboarding. In ancient times, including ancient Greece and Rome, drowning served as a punishment for specific crimes. During the Middle Ages and religious movements, it became a method to suppress new religious beliefs. The execution by water, commonly known as water torture, stands as one of the most brutal historical forms of torture and execution. This involved compelling the victim to consume excessive water, leading to severe physical injury and eventual death. Typically, the initial step involves securely restraining the victim, preventing resistance or escape by tying hands and feet to a chair or bed. At this point, the victim was coerced to ingest substantial amounts of water, either directly through intubation into the stomach or orally, sometimes using devices like funnels. As the water volume in the body increased, electrolyte balance was disrupted, particularly causing a decline in blood sodium levels. This imbalance resulted in severe consequences such as brain swelling and other complications. Symptoms included headache, nausea, vomiting, respiratory distress, and intense abdominal pain due to water pressure on internal organs. Ultimately, death occurred due to organ damage or brain swelling. Number 9. Impalement. What about more executions using animal methods? It is logical that throughout human history, unusual punishment should include many tactics based on the orifice, and the anus is a sensitive and taboo point for torture. One of these methods is impalement, which was most favored by Vlad the Impaler in 15th century Romania, and it has been said that Vlad once did this to 20,000 people, all while enjoying a luxurious meal. In this method, the victim is placed on their stomach with their hands tied behind their back. Then, a long pole with a conical sharp end, approximately the diameter of a man's arm, slightly lubricated, is inserted into the body through the anus or vagina. The position of the pole in the body was chosen to avoid vital organs so that the person would remain alive for a longer period. Then the stake was erected in a public place, and the pressure of the body's weight caused the pole to gradually penetrate deeper into the body, damaging tissues and internal organs. This process could take hours or even days. The victim, in a semi-conscious state, witnessed the collapse of their body during this time. Eventually, the victim died after prolonged suffering and pain due to internal bleeding, shock, or infection. Death, which sometimes occurred after several days, was ultimately an end to this terrible suffering. This method is known in history as one of the most terrifying execution methods, not only because of the intensity of physical pain, but also because of the psychological dimension of torturing and humiliating the victim. Number 8. Live burial. This is somewhat self-explanatory. In this method, the victims are usually buried alive in a coffin. Imagine that you can't move, you can't see, it's hard to breathe, you're extremely hot, and you're sick of the smell of your sweat. One of the last recorded cases was during the Nanking Massacre in 1937, when Japanese soldiers buried Chinese civilians alive. Another historical example of live burial is from the ancient Roman Empire, where slaves, criminals, and Vesta virgins were punished in this way. Additionally, in some ancient cultures, this method was used as part of religious sacrificial ceremonies. For example, it is said that in ancient Egypt, when an Egyptian pharaoh or king died, some of their servants, workers, and sometimes even their wives or mistresses were buried alive to accompany them in the afterlife. These people often did this voluntarily or under social pressure, believing that their actions would lead them to eternal life with the pharaoh. Number 7. Blood eagle. If you've watched the Viking series, you know exactly what I am about to discuss. The blood eagle was one of the most terrifying methods of execution and torture in Scandinavian history, particularly among the Vikings, recognized as a symbol of punishment for treason or grave crimes. This method, primarily used as a ceremonial execution, involved several horrifying steps. The first stage was opening the back. In this phase, The condemned was laid on their stomach, and their back was slit from the upper waist to the neck using a knife or a sharp blade. Next, the ribs of the condemned were slowly separated from the spine and spread outwards, resembling the open wings of an eagle, creating a visual representation of an eagle. In the following stage, the internal organs of the person, especially the lungs, were carefully extracted from the back and placed over the person's shoulders. This method was excruciatingly painful, and the condemned typically died during this process, either due to severe bleeding or the shock from the pain. The blood eagle was also known as a spiritual and fearsome symbol in Viking culture. It was believed that this method could completely separate the souls of the condemned from their bodies, so in addition to physical torture, it also brought psychological terror. Number 6. Boiling. One of the most famous methods of execution that was used in most ancient societies. Death was by boiling. For example, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, thousands of Christians were boiled in oil. Also in the Middle Ages, boiling was used as a method of execution for counterfeiters, swindlers, and coin forgers. This method began by filling a large cauldron with water or oil and heating it to boiling point. The condemned was then slowly placed into the boiling cauldron, prolonging their pain and agony. In some instances, to extend the duration of punishment, the condemned would initially be placed in a cauldron with moderate temperature, which was then gradually heated until it boiled, effectively cooking the victim slowly. In this process, exposure to extreme temperatures caused severe and unbearable burns to the skin and body tissues, which could last from several minutes to several hours. During the boiling method, the condemned would experience the most intense pain, and their screams could be heard from far distances, making this method not only a punishment for the condemned, but also a tool to terrify onlookers and the general public. Number 5. Ling. Ling, known as death by 1,000 cuts, was an extremely brutal method of torture and execution used in ancient China. This method was employed until the early 20th century and was a symbol of severe and terrifying punishment in Chinese society. Ling was often used to punish major crimes such as treason, familial murder, or rebellion against the monarchy. In the Ling method, the condemned was slowly dismembered piece by piece. First, the condemned was tied to a wooden post at the city gate or market for people to gather and witness this cautionary spectacle. Then the executioner would enter the scene with a sharp and cutting knife. He would start by cutting smaller parts of the bodies, such as the fingers of the hands and feet of the condemned. This was done slowly and carefully to prevent quick death. After the fingers, it was time to cut the flesh of the chest, arms, and legs. The cuts were made in such a way to avoid immediate fatal wounds. In later stages, vital parts of the body such as the chest and abdomen were targeted. This stage was often carried out slowly to keep the condemned alive as long as possible. Sometimes, to prevent the condemned from passing out, they were given narcotics. Finally, the condemned was often killed by decapitation or a blow to the heart. This execution method, in addition to physical torture, also involved psychological torture, as it was believed at that time that if someone died with an incomplete body, their soul would not be at peace. This method was used since 900 AD and was eventually banned by China in 1905. Number 4. Sawing. Sawing people to death was, in fact, a popular method of execution in the ancient world. Romans, Iranians, Jews, and Egyptians all practiced this method of execution. The methods varied, but the most terrifying form of sawing, predominantly used in medieval Europe, was sawing the criminal upside down. In this method, the victim was hung upside down, and two people stood on either side, beginning to saw the victim slowly from the anus or vagina. This process was carried out slowly and carefully to keep the condemned alive as long as possible. As the sawing operation progressed, subsequent stages involved gradually cutting from the stomach area towards the heart and head. The rush of blood to the head kept the criminals awake during this horrific process. Sometimes the sawing process was only carried out up to the condemned's stomach area. After reaching this point, the condemned was left alone, without completing the operation to the end. This meant that the condemned could survive for a longer period, possibly several days. This situation, in addition to severe physical pain, imposed a very hard psychological torture on the condemned, as they were forced to spend hours or even days in a half-dead and painful state. In many cases, a large crowd gathered to watch this horrifying scene, which itself was part of the goal of frightening and warning others. Number 3. Brazen bull. The brazen bull or bronze bull was a gruesome method commonly employed in ancient Greece and Rome. This macabre execution involved a large hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull, equipped with a hatch for the condemned person to enter. Made of bronze, a metal with excellent heat conductivity, the bull statue was designed to enclose a human being. The condemned was placed alive inside, and the hatch was then closed, trapping the victim within. Beneath the bronze bull, an empty space housed a fire that gradually heated the metal. As the metal heated up, the victim inside experienced intense pain from being roasted alive. Their screams and moans channeled through tubes in the bull's structure, transformed into sounds resembling the bellowing of a bull, intensifying the terror of the execution. The victim's death typically ensued after a prolonged and agonizing period, resulting from severe burns, shock from the pain, or suffocation. The entire process was meticulously designed to inflict maximum pain and fear on both the victim and the horrified spectators. Number 2. Flaying. Flaying an enemy while alive is an ancient practice. Accounts attribute the practice to the ancient Assyrians, who were said to flay the skin from a captured enemy or rebellious ruler and nail it to the wall of his city, as warning to all who would defy their power. In the method of flaying, the condemned was first tied to a wooden structure to prevent movement. The executioner would then slowly start to separate the skin from the body using a knife or other sharp tools. This process usually began in sensitive areas and gradually spread to other parts of the body. In this method, they typically started by making cuts with a knife on the legs, buttocks, and torso, and tried to keep the skin of the victim as intact as possible. This was done very slowly and carefully to prevent the victim's quick death. The goal was to keep the victim alive as long as possible to endure more pain. In addition to causing severe pain, this method also posed a risk of infection and other side effects. Eventually, the victim's skin was completely removed from the body. Sometimes salt was poured on the victim's flesh for more pain, and after a long and painful period that could last several days, the victim would die from shock, blood loss, infection, or a combination of these factors. Number 1. Scaphism. Around 500 BC, the Persian king Ardashir II initiated a method of punishment for his brother's killer known as scaphism, or the boats. In this method, 2 boats were positioned on top of each other with holes, such that only the victim's head, hands, and feet protruded. The condemned individual was laid on their back inside these boats, which were then firmly fastened together with nails and screws. Next, a mixture of milk and honey was poured into the unfortunate person's mouth until they were full to the point of nausea and developed severe diarrhea. Their face, legs, and arms were also smeared with this mixture, and they were left in a stagnant pool of water, exposed to the sun. This procedure was repeated daily, attracting flies, bees, and other insects to the sweetness. These insects would settle on the victim's face and any parts of their body sticking out of the boats, tormenting and biting them severely. Moreover, their abdomens, swollen with milk and honey, would excrete liquid feces, leading to the breeding of a large number of worms and various creatures. As the victim lay stretched out in the boats, the worms began to reproduce within their body. Their flesh, rotting in its own filth, was consumed by the worms. This torture typically lasted for several days or even weeks. During this time, the condemned person was slowly eaten by insects while still alive, eventually leading to a prolonged and horrific death. The combination of physical and psychological torture, resulting from pain, heat, thirst, hunger, and the constant attack of insects, made this execution method one of the most terrifying ways to die. Hello guys, this is my first video. I'm going to talk about interesting topics through animation in this channel. If you like, you can subscribe to my channel and share your views with me.